I want to start with what I think has been the most influential single story of human development that's been used for advice probably ever, but certainly in modern story. And it starts with this guy, Tiger Woods, the golfer, right? He very famously was given a putter by his father when he was 7 months old. When he was 10 months, he started imitating his father's swing. And actually, if you go on YouTube and you look at him and you look him up as a 2-year-old, you can see him on national television showing off his golf swing as a 2-year-old. By the age of 3, his father says he was saying, "I'm going to be the next Jack Nicklaus, the next great golfer in the world." So he's very driven from a very young age. He was famous by the time he was a teenager. And by the time he was the age of 21, he was the greatest golfer in the world. So it's sort of this quintessential story about the power of a head start, or maybe you've heard it called the 10,000 hours rule, right? Getting this very early start in something very, very specific and just training in that and never deviating. Another really famous example of that it's in a number of best-selling books. It comes from this family, the Polgars. There's 3 Polgar sisters, and this is them with their father. His name was Laszlo. He decided that he would train them in chess in a very, technical way, not playing, like very rigorous training from a very young age. And really what he wanted to do was to show that with a head start in very specific training, so-called what scientists call deliberate practice. That means it's not playing. It's like you're getting coached all the time and told what to do. That with a head start, any kid could become a genius in anything, right? He was just using chess as an example. But he really wanted this to just show that if you picked something early and got a head start in that, you could become one of the best in the world at anything. And so I had been, before I became a writer, I had been training to be a scientist. And then I left that career path and eventually became the science writer at Sports Illustrated. And I sort of got interested in these stories. And in fact, this Polgar experiment, two of Laszlo's daughters went on to become grandmaster chess players. So it's a very compelling story. But when I got to Sports Illustrated, I said, okay, I want to use my science background to sort of explore some of this and see what the reality behind the stories is. And I said, well, I'll start in sports since I work at a sports magazine. And if this is true, this idea that you need a head start in this very focused practice, again, not playing around, then we should see that athletes who go on to become professionals get a head start in exactly that kind of practice, like Tiger Woods usually. And so I started looking at lots of studies of elite athletes. In fact, when scientists study elite athletes, they spend more time in so-called deliberate practice. Again, remember, not playing around. This is like someone telling you exactly what to do. They spend more time in that than do lower level athletes. It's not a real big surprise, right? You need to practice. But then I started looking at studies that actually followed athletes over the course of their career from when they were kids, not just starting when they were already professionals. And when you look at that research, the pattern actually looks like this. So the athletes who go on to become the best, they actually spend less time early in life in that kind of deliberate practice. In fact, they almost always, not always, there's a huge amount of variation in people's lives, but the norm is not the Tiger model. The norm is they have what scientists call a sampling period, where they do a whole bunch of different activities, right? Those can be other sports. It might be dance. It might be rock climbing. It might be surfing, martial arts. And they often do a lot of it in an unstructured manner. So they're playing with friends, they're playing by themselves, they're not being coached all the time, they're not doing that deliberate practice. And they gain these sort of general skills of how to use their body. They learn about what things they like the most, what they're interested in, what things they seem to be good at. And they actually delay picking something to specialize in until later than the people who plateau at lower levels. So that was a bit of a surprise to me because it didn't comport with sort of the most famous studies, most famous stories in the field that we're usually told. So I was a little surprised. So then I said, now I'm really curious. So I want to go look at other fields that we usually think of people needing a head start in. We say, oh, well, if you don't start really young, you can't be good at this. And the next one that came to my mind was music, where we think of, you have to start really young. So I looked at music research and saw results like this. This is research from a world famous music academy. And what you don't have to look at the numbers too carefully. What I want to draw your attention to is this. So not until their 3rd instrument did the musicians who the professors said were the best, the exceptional ones, start spending more time in that kind of deliberate practice. Remember, this is like not just playing around or experimenting. Not until the 3rd instrument did they start spending more time in that kind of practice than musicians who the professor said were not quite as good. So they also had this kind of sampling period where they tried different instruments. They spent a lot of time just goofing around, playing around, seeing what they liked, what they were good at. And this turns out to be true even for musicians that are sort of famously good when they're young. So one, maybe you've heard of Yo-Yo Ma, the cellist. He was really good when he was young, but he actually also tried a couple of instruments first and they weren't a good fit for him. And then he found cello and that took off. Now he did all this when he was pretty young, but he still had that so-called sampling period where he had a chance to try a whole bunch of different things before focusing. The problem is most of this research is really pretty much ignored. And there's just stories that are much more influential. So all the research gets pushed to the side and just a few stories make a much bigger impact. Like there was a famous book some years ago called The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. And it was, the author was a mother of some very accomplished daughters. And on the very first page of the book, she says, I'm going to give you the secrets to raising stereotypically successful children, I think is how she put it. And she recounts assigning one of her daughters violin, just making her do violin and do 5-6 hours of very coached practice every day. And that really stuck in a lot of readers' minds as advice that you need to start very early. But later in the book, the author, to her credit, says that her daughter came to her when she was 13 years old and said, you know what, you picked violin, I didn't, and basically quits. And so people didn't really remember that part of the story. So that didn't have as much impact. So we keep telling people you have to start as early as you can in this very coached way, even though that's not really what the science says. And so after I saw that in another area where this advice to always get a head start wasn't really how it played out in reality, I started to wonder about domains that affect even more people than sports and music, like education. I was curious how this looked for the education world. And an economist found what's called a natural experiment. A natural experiment is when you didn't set it up. It's just something that's happening out in the world that you decided to study. And it has the sort of the setup of an experiment. He found a natural experiment in the college systems of England and Scotland. So what the situation was that in this period that he studied, England and Scotland had very similar college systems, very similar. The main difference was that in England, students had to pick a specialty like around 15 or 16 because they had to take tests and apply to a specific area of study. So they had to know what they wanted to do as teenagers. Whereas in Scotland, the difference was even in college, they could keep trying different stuff if they wanted to, all the way throughout the end of college if they wanted to. They didn't have to, but if they wanted to, they could keep trying things or keep sampling, like the athletes and like the musicians. And so this scientist's question was, who wins? Who gets the better side of this trade-off? The people who have to specialize early or the people who get to try more things and delay what they're figuring out what they're most interested in. And what he saw was that those early specializers actually do make more money when they get out of college because they've learned more specific knowledge about an area where they can then go work. But the later specializers who are trying more things in college, they when they do end up picking something, they have higher what economists call match quality. And that means the fit between who you are, the things you like, the things you're good at, that you're interested in, and what you're actually doing, the work you're actually doing, that how good that fit is. And so the later specializers had tried more things. And so when they did pick, they had a better fit. And so their growth rates were faster. And so by 6 years out of college, they had erased that income gap, right? Not that money is the most important thing you should be thinking about, but it's something that economists obviously measure when they are doing research. Not only that, but the later specializers were staying in there, they were remaining interested, while the early specializers were quitting the careers they had chosen in much higher numbers, even though they'd had a head start. Because it turned out that they were made to pick so early that they more often just made bad decisions. It's like anything. If someone forces you to pick something really early before you've had a chance to explore what's out there, you're more likely to make a poor decision. And so the pattern was where people are always told, pick early, pick early, pick early. But the real pattern was the early specializers won in the short term and lost in the long run. The late specializers lost in the short term, but really won in the long run. And that's now been shown over a number of different other studies in education, but we never really tell these stories, right? We rarely do. Even though when I went and researched people whose work I most admired, I saw these stories everywhere. So like Duke Ellington, who is, arguably the most creative American composer ever. He actually had a chance to take music lessons when he was a kid and said no, he didn't want to. Even though the teacher he was offered had this great name, her name was Marietta Clinkscales, but he still said, no, I don't want to take those music lessons. He wanted to focus on baseball and painting and drawing. And he was later offered an art scholarship to college that he turned down, but he only came back to music later and became, again, I think, the most creative composer in the history of American music. Or Mariam Mirzakhani, she was dreamed when she was a kid of being a novelist. Like she always wanted to be at the bookstore. She wanted to write fiction. And that ended up going out the window later. She didn't really like math when she was young. But then as she got older, she realized math was different than what she thought. And she actually went on to become the first and so far only woman to win what's called the Fields Medal, which is like the Nobel Prize of math. It's the biggest, it's the biggest prize in math that you can win. And she had wanted to be a writer when she was growing up. Or Vincent van Gogh, who is one of the most influential artists in the world. Even if you haven't heard of him, you've probably actually seen some of his work. So if you Google him or Google Starry Night, you'll see that you probably recognize his work, even if you don't know who he is. He actually had 5 different careers in his young life. And each time he changed to a different career, he had been a teacher, he'd worked at a bookstore, he had been an art dealer, he was training to be a pastor, then he was sort of a roving preacher. So he had all these different careers. And every time he changed, he would say, okay, now I found the thing that's perfect for me. I'm sure of it. He would say that like right away. And then as a little time went on, it would be like disastrous. And he would realize it didn't fit his talents. It didn't hold his interest. And so he would just leave these 5 careers. And so he was in his late 20s already. He had like flamed out on all these careers, had no idea what to do. He had no possessions. He had no achievements. He'd given away all of his stuff. The only thing he could think to do is he was living among some peasants and he wanted to draw their way of life. So he bought a beginner's book called The Guide to the ABCs of Drawing, just very beginner stuff in his late 20s, and started drawing. And that turned out to ignite a passion in him. And he became one of the most influential artists of all time. And again, didn't even turn to this until he had failed in other careers in his late 20s. Or another person whose work I've really admired by the name of Claude Shannon. So Claude Shannon was studying electrical engineering at the University of Michigan. And to fill a requirement, he wasn't allowed to take only engineering classes. So he took a philosophy course because he had to take stuff outside of electrical engineering. And in that philosophy course, he learned about something that seemed like it was totally useless. It was a system of logic that had been invented almost 100 years ago, where you could take true and false statements and you could replace the true and false with ones and zeros. And then you could solve the statements like they were math equations, basically. And it was cool for a philosophy course, but it really hadn't accomplished anything again in about a century. But then Claude did an internship at a phone company. And at the time, phones were very different. There were relay switches that routed calls. And he realized that he could use those switches, whether they were open or closed, like ones or zeros. And so he took this logic and could program it into circuits. And that gave birth essentially to what's known as binary code, which is the systems of ones and zeros that all of our digital computers rely on today. So this gave birth to one of the major insights that created computers, just because he happened to be working in these 2 different areas. As Claude said, just so happened that nobody else was familiar with these 2 things at the same time. So again, it was really expanding his horizons. It was sort of the secret to his success. And finally, this is me with someone I sort of consider a role model. This is Frances Hesselbein, right? And that's me with her. Frances did a ton of volunteering in her life. She didn't have some grand plan of what she was going to be later in life. As she said, she would just do what's needed at the time. So she would see something needed around her in her community and she would volunteer. She didn't have a real professional job until the age of 54. But in all this volunteering, she sort of cobbled together a unique set of skills and experiences. And so age 54, she takes her first professional job and pretty soon goes on to become the CEO and the head officer of the Girl Scouts. And the Girl Scouts were in this, and she took over the Girl Scouts in the 1970s, and they were in big trouble because society had changed a lot in the late 1960s, where Girl Scouts had been preparing girls for life at home, essentially, and society was going through a big change where now Girls were going to become women who would have jobs in math and science and in every area. And so Girl Scouts was losing members. Volunteers were leaving, members were leaving. It was in huge trouble. And Frances came in and turned the whole place around. And she added, she threw out all the old stuff, used all these experiences she had accumulated to change all the materials and their focus. Here's one of the badges she created from her tenure. This is binary code. So that Shannon, his invention led to it, his insight led to it, for girls that are learning about computers. So she changed the whole organization. She saved it. She added 130,000 volunteers, just people that wanted to work with her. And she tripled minority membership, and she really saved the place. And she's still trying new stuff. This is a picture of me with her in March. Today, she runs a leadership institute in New York City where she works 5 days a week, and she's 104. She's still trying new stuff at 104. And last time I saw her, she was pestering me to write something new for her. So it's never too late to keep trying new stuff. And in fact, it's sort of an asset. But again, we don't usually hear these stories, right? We just hear about the Tiger Woods stories. We don't hear about stories like this, even though they're the norm. We don't hear about research like this. And there was research. I saw one of the other Farnham Street lessons was about entrepreneurship, right? And nobody really publicizes very much like the research that just last year was from MIT and US Census Bureau and Northwestern University. And they collaborated to show that the average age of someone who founds a fast-growing tech company is 45.4. That's way older than I would have guessed, right? Because we're so obsessed with these head starts that we don't pay attention to stuff like that. Or that LinkedIn, which probably, no reason for you to be on LinkedIn now, but it's a place where people put their professional histories and look for jobs. They did their own research on 500,000 members of their community and found that one of the best predictors of who would go on to become an executive, like an important person in their organization, was the number of different jobs that someone had worked in. So trying these different things. But we don't tell these stories, even when the people's work is very famous. So for example, here's a guy who I've kind of followed. Maybe you have. Here he is at age 6. He's wearing a Scottish rugby kit, because he was into rugby. He tried a whole bunch of different sports. He did some tennis, some wrestling, skiing. His mother was a tennis coach, but she decided not to coach him because he wouldn't do that deliberate practice, right? He wouldn't return balls normally. He wanted to goof around, so she wouldn't coach him. He did some table tennis. He did some basketball, swimming. When his coaches actually came to him and said, you're pretty good. We want you to play with the older boys. He said no, because I just want to talk about WWE, after practice with my friends. I don't want to move. And he kept trying more sports: soccer, handball, volleyball, skateboarding, badminton. Like he tried everything. He wasn't so focused on being the next great in any particular thing like Tiger Woods was. And so think for a minute, guess in your head, who do you think this sampler who is all over the place, unlike Tiger Woods, is? Okay, this is Roger Federer. Okay, he turned out okay. Now, Roger Federer is every bit as famous as Tiger Woods as an adult, right? And yet, even people who follow tennis don't know the story of his development. Why? Even though it's the norm, and the Tiger story is the exception. And so why is that? I think there's sort of two main reasons. One is that Tiger's story is really dramatic, right? That he picked this thing from the time he was very young and stuck with it. Also, I think it's because there's like a whole industry that uses that story of Tiger Woods to say, this is a lesson for what you should do in your life and whatever you want to be good at. Never mind golf, whatever you want to be good at. You want to be a video game designer, you want to be an entrepreneur, whatever. This is the lesson you should follow. And I think that's a problem, actually, a big problem, because it turns out that golf is actually a really bad example from which we can take that kind of advice and extrapolate it to other things. Golf is what this psychologist by the name of Robin Hogarth called a kind learning environment. And what he meant by kind learning environment was something like golf, where you know what to do next because someone tells you that's in the rules. The rules never change. Right? It's always the same. When you do something, you get feedback right away and it's accurate, right? You see where the ball went. And the game tomorrow and next year and the year after that will look the same as it did yesterday. Things don't change. Or chess is in many ways similar to that. Remember we started with golf and chess? Chess is also a kind learning environment. It's based on pattern recognition. So great chess players do have to specialize pretty early. They have to start serious study before the age of 12, pretty much, because they have to learn these patterns. It's a kind learning environment. The rules never change. And so you need to learn these patterns, but that's also why computers master it so easily. So in these areas where its early specialization works really well, you may not want to be in those areas that much longer because that's where computers take over first. On the other end of the spectrum are what the psychologist Robin Hogarth called wicked learning environments. Wicked learning environments, there may not be anybody telling you exactly what to do next, right? There may or may not even be rules. And if there are, they might change overnight. You may sometimes get feedback when you do something and sometimes you won't. Sometimes the feedback will be inaccurate. So you have to find other ways to learn other than just experience. And sometimes feedback will also be delayed, which can be very difficult to deal with. And you can count on the fact that the work you're doing now will look different next year, right? It's not like golf. It's not like chess. The rules won't stay the same. And so which one of these, you know, if you follow our world, sounds more like the one we're spending more time in? Probably more of it. Both. We need both. But increasingly more of this, and this was true even before, you know, the pandemic and everything like that. Work was moving more in this way, where we need to have a broader view and be adaptable and think about how different parts and disciplines interconnect with one another. In fact, the need to do that, to have flexible thinking, has really fundamentally changed the way that we think, that our brains even work. So when you look at this diagram, for example, the central circle on the right probably looks larger to you because your brain is drawn to the relationship of the parts in the whole here. Whereas someone who hasn't really engaged in the modern world and been exposed to this need for flexible thought and thinking about how things connect, they will see correctly, by the way, that the central circles are actually the same size. And so here we are in this wicked world where we need to think in a flexible way and keep track of lots of different interconnecting parts. And in that world, sometimes specializing too much, too early, or too narrowly can actually backfire really badly. So, for example, we think of doctors, right, as where you really want specialists. And there's no question that more and more specialists in medicine have been helpful. It's been both inevitable and it's been very helpful, but it's also been a double-edged sword. So, for example, there's been some recent research that looks at some of the most popular surgeries in the world and the way they examine if they really work. So one of them is a knee surgery, for example, that's done millions of times over the world. And finally, someone decided to see if it really works. And so they took some patients and gave them what's called sham surgery. That means they cut into their knee, banged around like they were actually doing surgery, and then just sewed them back up without doing the surgery. And it turned out that performed just as well as the actual surgery. So the surgery wasn't really working, but specialists who'd been trained to do it continued to do it even after this evidence. So the specialists are critical, but they can also sometimes have sort of blinders on for things they're used to doing if they get too narrow. So in fact, related to the situation we're in now, this is a recent editor's pick article from a journal of the Association of Physicians Who Work in Hospitals, learning to unspecialize in the COVID pandemic. So we have this fast moving situation. And one of the realizations has been that when doctors are too specialized, it's hard for them to adapt to these fast moving situations. So I think the situation we have right now with the pandemic is going to lead to some sort of new thinking about how healthcare works in some ways. So again, we're in this kind of wicked world where things are changing all the time. We have to think on our feet, and we're told to do this, right? We're told to do that. This is the path to success. Tiger would pick early from the time you're really young and just travel this straight path. But instead, all the research seems to suggest that this is the much more typical path towards success, that you have these false starts and you have to bounce around a little bit and figure out what you're good at and what you're interested in, how the world's changing and all these things. And that looks like that. I just want to share a few examples from domains where research suggests that you want to keep yourself broad for a long time instead of going for that sort of golf. You know, if you want to be a golfer, I think maybe you can argue for, and a chess player, you can argue for that head start, but other areas are different. So let's say in technological invention, for example, if we look at patent research, for a lot of the 20th century, the most, patents are sort of a form of invention. They were written by teams that went deeper into one area of technology. And the US Patent Office classifies these areas of technology. But then as we fast forward to the information age, where suddenly there's all this information really quickly available to everyone in the world, Now a lot of the most important inventions were often being undertaken or being discovered or developed by people who'd worked in a whole bunch of different technological classes, and they would combine things to make inventions, or teams that included people like that. So you actually wanted to work sort of more broadly. And one guy who I really admired, who was kind of on the forefront of this trend, is a Japanese man named Gunpei Yokoi. And he actually didn't do that. He studied electronics in school, but he didn't do that well on his exams. And so instead of going to a big company in Tokyo, like a lot of his friends, he had to settle for a lower job, a lower tier job as a machine maintenance man at a playing card company in Kyoto. And the company was in huge trouble. The business was going down the tubes, and they had to find some other stuff to do to save the business, basically. And he wanted to help. And he knew that he wasn't equipped to work on the cutting edge of technology, right? But he went looking for something that he thought customers wanted. And one day he was riding the train while he was commuting, and he saw a bunch of bored people doing like this, playing with calculators just to try to be less bored on the train. And he said, gosh, that's not very fun playing with calculators like that. Maybe I can give them something more fun. And so he went and looked for old technology that he could understand. And he took some old technology from calculators using the screens and some other technology from credit cards that was already well known. He combined them and he made handheld games. And these were a hit. And this playing card company that had been founded 100 years earlier in a little wooden storefront suddenly became a toy and game operation. You may have heard of it. It's called Nintendo, right? He was the machine maintenance man who turned it into a toy and game operation. And he coined this philosophy, this creative philosophy that translates from Japanese to something like lateral thinking with withered technology. I know that's a mouthful, but what he meant was, by withered technology, he meant he wasn't trying to reinvent the wheel. He's taking stuff that other people had created that was already well understood, and just lateral thinking meant combining it in ways that people hadn't seen before, that maybe specialists were too narrow to see because they weren't looking for things from different areas. And his masterwork, you might call it, was this, the Game Boy. So this thing, I know it looks like a technological joke right now. It looked like a technological joke even then. The processor was a decade old. Look at this screen. This screen was never attractive. It looks like rotting lettuce. It had 4 grayscale shades, and they smeared across the screen if you played a game that was moving fast, right? And when this was coming out, Sega and Atari were coming out with competitors. So one of Yokoi's colleagues came to him and said, we're in big trouble. Sega and Atari are launching their competitors. And Yokoi said, well, are they color? And the man said, yes. And so he said, then don't worry about it. We're fine. Because he knew that what the players actually cared about at the time was durability, portability, battery life, affordability, the price of the Game Boy, the game selection. And he used this easy technology. So it was almost like an iPhone where everyone else could start making stuff for his platform. And it blew the competition away. It became the best-selling video game console of the 20th century. And when I was learning about researching Nintendo, I went and found mine in my parents' basement in Chicago. This is mine. As you can see, seen better days. But look, the red light is on. So I flipped it on, played a little Tetris, which I thought was especially impressive, because then I flipped it over and the batteries had expired in 2007 and 2013, and I could still play it. So it was very impressive, because he sort of knew what his customers wanted, basically. And this kind of finding this advantage of being broad holds in other more subjective realms too, like comic books. So starting in the early 1970s, there had been from the mid 50s to the early 70s censorship in comics. So there was this body that had to approve what was in a comic book before it could be published. And then Stan Lee wrote a Spider-Man in 1971, in which one of Peter Parker's friends overdoses on prescription drugs. And this comic book was meant to educate the public about prescription drug abuse. And the censorship committee didn't approve. And Stan Lee and Marvel decided to publish it anyway. And that led to it was so well received by readers that it ended censorship almost overnight. And that started this period of creative explosion in comic books. And so a pair of researchers decided to study, starting at that period for the next 20 years, what in that creative explosion era caused some comic book creators to be better at making comics, make comics that became more desired and more valuable than others. And they thought it would be the number of years of experience someone had in making comic books. That turned out to be wrong. So they thought, okay, well, maybe it's the, how rich their publisher is, the amount of resources they have, but that was wrong too. well, it's got to be the number of previous, like the Tiger story, got to be the number of previous comics they've made, but that was wrong also. The best predictor turned out to be the number of different comic book genres that a creator had worked in. So crime, drama, nonfiction, fantasy, whatever. There were 22 different genres. And the more a creator had worked in, the better off, the more creative they became. The problem was those creators in building up all that experience from different genres, they would just look like they were behind at first, right? So it's likely that a lot of them were told, like, you're getting behind, stop switching between different kinds of comics. But actually that's what became their superpower, even though they were discouraged from it. So again, keeping this broad view is a big advantage. The problem is it goes against getting a head start, right? I think our push to always feel like we're on a head start, this idea that it seems like if you're ahead of someone, you'll always be ahead of them because it's a stable trajectory, turns out to be wrong. And I think because we think that's true, we even undermine sort of the basic way we learn things. So for example, in a recent study of 7th grade math classrooms done just last year, classrooms were randomly assigned. So they would just get randomly picked to get one of two different types of math teaching. Some of the classrooms got what's called blocked practice, which is like this. You get problem type A, B, 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 and so on. So you do a problem type and then you practice it, practice it, practice it. Then the next problem type, practice, practice, practice. Next problem type, so on. Other classrooms got what's called interleaved practice. I know that's a weird word, but interleaved practice. Some people call it mixed practice, where instead of getting this, you get this. It's like as if all the problem types were just thrown in a hat and you just start picking them out at random. This is much harder. In this case, the students get more frustrated. The progress is slower. They're more upset with their teacher. But instead of just learning how to do something over and over, they're actually learning how to match a math strategy to a type of problem. And so when the test came around, this group that was more frustrated and working slower blew the other group away. This is something that psychologists call a desirable difficulty. It makes learning more difficult, slower, but is desirable because it leads to better performance in the long run. Now, so just want to conclude here, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that we have all these cultural signals and advice and articles and books and talks that say, pick something as early as you can, get a head start, make as fast progress as you can. But in fact, that sometimes undermines our long-term development. Now was a strange idea to me, the idea that sometimes getting a head start cannot be the best thing for you in the long run. But that's what the science says. I think overall, I think it's clear that we need both people who follow this path, the Tiger path, and people who follow the Roger path. We want to make room for both of these. The trouble is we're always incentivizing this one. So in the words, for example, of an eminent physicist and mathematician and a writer who I love named Freeman Dyson, who passed away recently, he said, if we want to have a healthy ecosystem, we need both birds and frogs. The frogs are down here in the mud. They're looking at little details. They're getting very specialized and very narrow and delving deeper, 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 deeper into things. The birds, they're soaring up above. They're not seeing those details that the frogs are seeing, but they're looking at integrating the knowledge of the frogs. They're looking across all these different areas and combining things, sort of like Yokoi did, sort of like the comic book creators did. And as he said, we need both of these things. We need both. We need the birds and the frogs for a healthy ecosystem. What Dyson said, the problem is we're only telling people to become frogs. So we're getting more and more frogs and we might be at risk of getting fewer birds, even though these are people that we know are succeeding and providing invaluable contributions. And so he said, if we do that, if we only incentivize the frogs, then we won't be very adaptable, right? Nobody will know what anybody else is working on, and we won't be able to adjust when the world changes. And obviously that becomes a pretty important thing. And so I think it's just important to be aware that as you develop, as you choose what to study in school, what to try in sports, what interests, to bring in or to push out, that it can be really short-sighted to do only what's in the interest of a head start as opposed to exploring your interests and your potential abilities. And anytime you do try something and then switch, look, I was living in a tent in the Arctic training to be a geologist when I decided to become a writer, and pretty soon was a sports writer. Those things are pretty far apart. But it turned out that my experience in the science world, where I was around a bunch of other scientists, I was sort of ordinary as a scientist. Then you go to a sports magazine, you take that science education, and suddenly you're totally extraordinary. So your experiences are never wasted. You can take them somewhere else where suddenly they're more rare. And that becomes kind of your superpower. So that's been the experience of my career. And so I was curious, I was interested to see a lot of the research sort of suggest that that's actually the norm in many cases, as opposed to the exception. So I want to stop there, get off my little soapbox, and I'm happy to chat about this stuff in the sports world, in the art world, whatever, or wherever you want. Or just to talk about if you're interested in science writing in general, I'm happy to talk about that as well.
Wow.
As a writer, do you find it hard to come up with new ideas?
Sometimes, yeah, especially when I was starting out. So one of the hardest times, so one of my first jobs was at a newspaper in New York City. And then it was not hard to come up with ideas because there was always something happening, so you would just like go for it. Because I was like reporting on crime a lot and stuff, and there's always something going on. But then later on, my last job was at a place called ProPublica that does all investigative work only. And there, it's like I came there, and they're basically, it's a wonderful place, and they say, okay, just go find something really big, really important. We don't want you to do any normal stuff. Do something that's really important to people. And that is really hard. And so that is difficult. The things that help are, one, keeping a lot of different people that you talk to. So I think one of the most important things is being able to talk to or be around a lot of people who aren't in your circle normally, because the people that are sort of normally in your circle in the everyday scheme of things, they know a lot of the same things that you know, so to speak. And so you kind of want to get out there and meet people that are very different from you, because they'll have ideas that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And also to read that way too, to read like way outside of what you're normally looking at, and you can generate ideas that way, and to just sort of listen carefully. But it is difficult. And the more important the story, the more difficult it gets. Because like, when I was at Sports Illustrated, the time when I had no difficulty coming up with stories was like when I was at the Olympics, because then there's so many different things going. There's always something crazy happening. You just go to that. But in other times where I was writing about science or investigative topics, then it's quite difficult. So I would keep things sometimes that I call like a master thought list, where if I saw something interesting, this was just an electronic document. If I saw something interesting, read something interesting, heard something interesting, I would just write it down on this document and where I heard it, whether that was in a paper or from a person or on TV, whatever. And sometimes I would notice certain things would start building up, certain topics. And then I could sort of keep track of my interest. And sometimes, I would see that, oh, okay, there's a lot of interesting stuff in this area. I'm going to delve deeper into it. But it is difficult to come up with the best ideas. But I think you really want to keep a broad network and make sure to be interacting with people very different from you, with very different life experiences from you, because they will have knowledge and ideas that you don't have. And that's where a lot of ideas come from. Yeah, so I'm happy to take other questions if there's something you want to talk about. But yeah, if it's like how to be
Sorry, what would you, I'm curious to see what your thoughts are, when so many of us are influenced by a system that, by the end of grade, even as early as, grade 10, grade 11, grade 12, we have to start thinking about our futures and what we want to be and what we want to do. What would you have to say about that, or having to kind of be pushed to make a decision about a long-term commitment at such an early age?
Yeah, I think it's not great, and I wish we would relax that a little bit. I don't want to prescribe forcing someone to diversify any more than I want to prescribe forcing them to specialize, but I think, because like in Tiger's story, the two sort of influential prodigy stories, Tiger and Mozart, we kind of tell those a little wrong. Actually, in those cases, we always tell the stories if like their fathers forced them to do this thing. It's not the case. They actually showed this very unusual interest as kids, and then their fathers responded to that. So it wasn't forced upon them. It was just these rare cases where they showed this interest. And I think it's okay if somebody wants to do that, but I don't think a lot of people want to do that. They do it just because they think it's the way, to become successful. And I wish we would diversify the way we allow people to develop. It's more difficult, right? But I think about it as, to use a sports example, when Great Britain was awarded the Olympics for 2012, they brought in this brilliant woman named Chelsea Warr, who had helped Australia become really good at the Olympics. And one of the main, wasn't just her, but one of the main things that she did to get Great Britain back to being good at sports was to say, we're just going to diversify the ways that people can enter different sports. Like the kids who develop really quickly, we put all our attention into them. Those are the easiest ones to identify. And yet many of our best athletes are coming from out of nowhere, and we're not working to make it easier for those people. So I think we should, as a system, diversify the paths that we allow people to follow in that same way. And I think this is, so I'm adding an afterword to my book that discusses this research that looked at 12 countries where people were matched for their parents' education, their own years of education, their national test scores. The difference was, did they get career-focused education first, or did they get general education? And the pattern was those who got the earlier focus, they jump out to an income lead because they are trained for a specific field. They're more likely to be hired right out of training, but they end up so much less adaptable in a changing work world that they spend so much less time in the workforce over their life that they end up winning in the short term and losing in the long run. Same pattern. And if there's a shock to their industry, which seems like it's happening at least once a decade now, then they really have trouble recovering. And I think it's hard to believe sometimes that a head start can actually be bad. And I think one of the few things that's been sort of in the US supported by recent presidents on both sides of the aisle has been to have more apprenticeship programs like Germany, where you make people focus earlier. And in that research, the biggest advantage of any country for the general education was in Germany. So we're trying to be like a system and not looking at the research that says, in fact, in that country that we're trying to emulate, they have the biggest advantage for this general education system. The faster an economy was changing, the greater the advantage was for general education. So I think we should pay attention to our own research and try to take some of the pressures for short-term gains off of people. Like, we know this in the context of when you think about executives and like a stock price, say, if they're only focused on the short term, it's going to be bad for the long term. And then we neglect that when it comes to human development. And so I think I get a lot of questions from parents about, well, what should I do with my kid in sports who wants to do these different things, but the leagues won't let them, right? Like when I was living in Brooklyn until recently, and there was a U7 travel soccer team that met near me, right? I don't think 6-year-olds need to travel to find good enough competition in a city of 9 million people, but it's an adult that has a financial interest in forcing that to happen because they're the customers. And so I think we can't just step outside of the system, but I think we can try to keep our horizons broad, and especially with such easy access to information, step outside the algorithms that you're in sometimes. Follow people on social media that are totally different from you, that live in a different country and that have different backgrounds than you. Personally, I like to go to bookstores and libraries because your brain is not a recommendations algorithm, right? Those algorithms work on things that you already know you're interested in. So how do you find the things that you don't know you're interested in? Go to a library, go to a bookstore, go connect with people that are very different from you. So I think we can use our own time to kind of expand our horizons, even when sort of the system is trying to narrow them. And to that point, actually, this is interesting. One of the most common questions I got from young people when I was at Sports Illustrated was, it was usually people who were entering college or had just entered college, and they would say, should I major in, I want to be a sports writer. Should I major in journalism or English? And I would say, I have no idea. I majored in geology and astronomy. Okay, I have no clue. But I would say I'd tell them, statistics course, biology course, never hurt anybody, because you'll pick up those skills, other skills on the job. So if you can come to it with these oddball skills, then you're really, you really got something. It becomes this huge advantage. And so I would encourage them to sort of step off the path a little bit, even though that required a little bit more long-term vision, I guess.
Right. Just keep moving. Just keep moving. Keep doing new things. Experiences
are never wasted. When I left the science track, I initially thought like maybe that was a waste, and then it turned out to be like the most, because I don't write about the area of science that I studied, not at all. But that education and thinking, and that mode of thinking and being comfortable with scientific knowledge and statistics, I rely on it every day to do what I'm doing. I never would have thought that. But now looking back, I realize how none of the things, every time I changed directions and was like, because I came into Sports Illustrated as a temp fact checker. I was probably 6 years old, 5 or 6 years older than people I was doing much lower level work for. But then once I realized that I had these these unique background that could be applied here, then I just sort of like leapfrogged and became like the youngest senior writer there, like very, very quickly. Because if you have this unique mix of skills, I've heard some people call this skill stacking. We don't have to be the very best at any one thing, but you overlap different skills and experiences in a way that makes you unique. And that was the case for me. And so I sort of realized if I could use my oddball background, I didn't have to compete against anyone else. I was just competing against myself. And if I could do good work, that was fine because nobody else was on that turf, you know? And so I think finding your own turf, as opposed to worrying about, you know, who's your same age or younger, who might be doing better than you at one thing, don't worry about that. Like if I was worrying about that, I never would have set foot in the door at that place. Like worry about establishing your own turf, using your own interests and your own talents.